Hello, I'm Paul Woodadge of World War II TV.
And I'm Matt Bone from the Aviation Show.
And we're doing a double header, which we've never done before. And so far, the tech is working. And we have with us Dr. Victoria Taylor, who has a brand new book out. Matt, what's the book?
The book is Hiding.
Because you've got it
Here.
and I haven't.
Yes, there it is. And you've got me doing the plastic covery thing, so I'll try not to.
I know. I'm sorry I got you into that. It's a real geeky thing. I cover all my books now. Yeah.
So therapeutic, ladies and gentlemen. It's fantastic. But yes, Victoria's book is Eagle Days, Life and Death for the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. And as you can see, I have put many a post-it in there. Yeah. So there we go. So that's lots of questions. And congratulations, because I think we last saw each other at Q in the archive when we bumped it.
Did.
Yeah. And you were desperately working through this. So it's out next week. How do you feel?
Yeah.
Well, before I say how I feel, thank you so much to you both for having me on. It's so lovely to be reunited in different ways with you both. The feeling is relief, but also exhaustion. I'm not sure if the sort of exhilaration has kicked in yet. It might do on the actual day itself, but right now it's just sort of having crawled through the broken glass and just celebrating not getting cut is sort of how I feel right now.
Oh, congratulations, because
absolutely.
It's there. It's beautifully put together by the team at Head of Zeus as well. So, and thank you, Catherine, for sending me the copy before you sent one to Woody, which was very nice. There we go.
Well, sometimes I win. I didn't win this one.
It was no favoritism.
We had lunch at the San Diego conference, wasn't it? In April 2 years ago. So 2 years ago?
Yes, 2023. We did. Yes, I remember the calamari was fabulous.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, we're going to hand over to Matt for some of the questions. But folks, those who are watching on both channels, we will select some of your comments as we go along, just put up on screen. But there'll also be, hopefully, a bit of chance to get to some questions. Although Matt, I think, has covered most of the things you will be wanting to ask yourself about sources and things like that. But let's fire away and give Victoria her first test of her own book.
Yeah. When did you finish the edits? We'll see how long you've had to sort of wipe it from your memory.
Oh goodness. So they got pushed a little bit back and forth. There was a little bit of a delay on the editorial side, just sort of matter of course things. So it was a bit of sometimes I thought I had more time, sometimes I thought I had less time. So that was a little bit of that kind of steep learning curve, being a first-time author and things not always going how you expect them to. But in terms of the edits, best part over a few months. I think it was a case of not necessarily huge structural changes, but it's just, this is such a fiddly book. There's so many different little details, right down to each and every staffel or every squadron. It's so fiddly. And no doubt there'll be people that will take great joy in pointing something out. It took about, the main part of it really sort of knuckled down was about 3 to 4 months. But in terms of the actual overall process, it was really stretched out because I was sort of doing a lot of other professional things, but also had personal things happening. So it's felt like a really long journey.
You mentioned fiddly, and that goes straight into our first question, really, because your subject, the Luftwaffe and the Battle of Britain, you're straight into Great Britain psyche. It's entwined in us from an early age of Saturday afternoons watching the Battle of Britain and things. Yes. How do you start to unpick that when you're just looking at the Luftwaffe from your narrative? How tricky does that get to not get back into the stuff that we're all used to?
It gets tricky in terms of the fact that I found it initially difficult to place my mind in the head of the then enemy, because I was sort of looking at the Battle of Britain through the lens of British dates. So obviously I was going from about 10th of July 1940 to the 31st of October 1940 and thinking, oh, that's it. And of course I was thinking at it in terms of the sort of challenges that posed to the men of fighter command and the sort of the sheer scale of what it took to try and repel the Luftwaffe from the skies. So I kind of had to kind of disengage from it for a bit, and I really tried to read specifically on any books from the Luftwaffe before you go a little bit further into getting background from books that show both sides a bit better, like Stephen Bungay's Most Dangerous Enemy and things like that. But I think, to be honest, I only really started to get properly immersed when going to the German archives themselves, because I think it's that sense of, even just interacting with the archivists, there is this sort of hush, even though it's their work and, you know, they're tasked with that. You can almost feel like that heavy weight of history between the two, even though they were very courteous. So immediately, obviously, when you go to a British archive and you want to look at, I don't know, the RAF, you sort of geek out a bit. You know, I mean, as me and Matt will know, when we bumped into each other, you sort of geek out about aviation history. And I couldn't really do that in Germany because they don't want to be remembering that period too intensely. So I think firstly that, I think also, as I say, going through the letters themselves, you started to get all of these shades of having national memory and that kind of militarism that's drilled into the men. And it is quite stark compared to that in British letters, which I've read in the past. So I think it was that sense of understanding the kind of zeitgeist of the time and sort of feeling that sense of their pressure on their shoulders from a different way, and kind of trying to see the Battle of Britain from a mirror perspective, and sort of thinking, wait, well, hold on, you know, they've also got the expectations of the nation weighing on their shoulders. This was meant to be the Luftwaffe's finest hour. And as I write in the book, it ends up being its frittered hour. This was meant to be, in Goering's words, Germany's proudest victory. And it wasn't.
Yeah, I was going to make a joke about that, but I'm not. We're going to keep this reasonably highbrow until later. Just on the sources and things, was there much left? Because we know that there are gaps in the sources in Germany, and I sort of wrap that into the next bit as well, with when you get onto the post-war stuff, because you then have the Perselschein question of, you know, the famously Galland and Gagarin and those guys. Changing the perspective of where they were. How do the two come together when you're pulling the book together? How do you sort of mesh it and then shake off some of the stuff that you don't really want?
Good question. So in terms of finding the sources, you're absolutely right. They're incredibly scattered for the Luftwaffe. There's sort of three main issues with Luftwaffe sources in this period. So the first is that Goering had an awful lot of Luftwaffe documents destroyed to keep them out of Soviet hands in 1945 when the Soviets were coming in. They didn't want to be having incriminating information, particularly as it looked as if they were going to get to the heart of Germany first. So that had a wave of destruction of Reich ministry documents. There was, of course, war damage as well. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the Luftwaffe actually intended to relocate its archives. Even in 1943, they're still having the discussion of, well, when we win the war, you know, possibly ignoring that they've had to go to total war at this point. They say when we win the war in one of the Luftwaffe documents, they talk about how we're going to have to relocate the archives for the air war files because we'll need to be able to write these post-war histories. It never gets moved in the way that they intend. The air war, you know, the combined Allied bomber offensive gets too intense, so they can't make that relocation. But part of it is war damage as well. And then very, very annoyingly, which I found once reading some British some of the disarmament letters from the British Army on the Luftwaffe, the Allies, specifically the Western Allies, also deleted or destroyed a lot of Luftwaffe documents because they considered them dead files. They thought, right, okay, well, we don't need that for Nuremberg or whatever they needed to retain them for. So it was heartbreaking when I read that because I thought, oh my God, our own side got rid of them. So it is difficult. But luckily, the collection that I mainly drew upon was at the Bibliothek für Zeitgeschichte, and that's located in Stuttgart. And they've got a really good collection of field post, not just from the Luftwaffe, but also from the army as well. And thankfully, the reason that I was able to sort of diversify the Luftwaffe's experience in the Battle of Britain and not just look at its remembered flying arms, but also, you know, its ground crews, its personnel, even those that were stationed in the anti-aircraft units and air signals units. the reason is because luckily they had just kept this bank of letters and had started to transcribe them, which was so much easier considering that, you know, German handwriting, especially Sütterling, which is a very curly kind, is a nightmare to decipher even for Germans sometimes. So I really got lucky because I came across that collection in my PhD, and then didn't realize for some reason that I was missing July to October 1940. So I went back for a specific archival trip for that. And luckily, these letters were from the Luftwaffe, they were from all different branches and even from civilians. So that's ultimately what made the source of material that created Eagle Days.
I'm actually going to jump in with a question that I'm going to put through the words of a viewer, but it was something I was going to ask as well, because I know with the Battle of Britain, from the British point of view, there's a debate about when it starts and when it ends, and which bits of it you count as the Battle of Britain and what might be something else. So John Sowerby said, how did the Germans define the length of the Battle of Britain? Because that when you're starting a book, just deciding on your parameters is, I'm going to start on this day and explain why you're going to start on this day. So do the Germans see it to roughly the same dates as the Brits, or is there a different interpretation?
They see it quite differently. So that's an excellent question, John. The Germans refer to the campaign as the Luftschlacht um England, or the air battle for England. They stretch it across the entire 10 months of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. So their phases are a little bit different in terms of, they do still have the beginning with the Kanalkampf, or the Channel Battle. But even though we go for around the 10th of July 1940, as per Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding's in his own words, arbitrary dates, really you can pinpoint the 2nd of July 1940 as the beginning of the Battle of Britain for the Luftwaffe, because that's when they are ordered to start attacking Channel Sea traffic more intensively. So it goes from about the 2nd of July. The Luftwaffe veterans do sort of slightly have different opinions about the phases in their books. I think Adolf Galland is perhaps the clearest in terms of defining that. And they tend to they add in extra little stages, of course, that the British don't consider. So, for instance, Galland brings in the idea of the Jabelangriff, or the fighter bomber stage, where they sort of take away about a third of the single-seat fighter force, and they sort of end up, well, massacring them really to become fighter bombers, which they shouldn't be. And as a result, he includes that stage as well, which is sort of just after the opening of the Blitz, but not quite at the end of the Battle of Britain. So it's interesting when you look at their dates, they sort of put it all together. And I think when you put both sides of that together, you can see why the Luftwaffe feels this is such a disappointment as it goes into the spring of 1941, because it is a really relentless operation over Britain, and it's not really for much gain.
Good point. Back to you, Matt. I'll let you take over again.
No, and I think that's interesting as well, because the start for them is right in a period of incredible operation. It starts with Poland. They don't really get a rest over the winter. Then it's Norway, Denmark, France, and then straight in-ish to the Battle of Britain. So what sort of state is the Luftwaffe in? Because, you know, the traditional narrative is this monster arrives on the Channel coast and the plucky few Brits with maybe some other people that get thrown in there. That's modern speak, isn't it? But what is the state of the Luftwaffe? How are they operationally when they turn their forces against the RAF?
You're right. They don't have much time to galvanize themselves I think specifically post Battle of France, because when you look at the later stages of Fall Rot, or Case Red, on the ground specifically, there is a lot more intensive fighting amongst the French. But the thing is that the Luftwaffe has been deployed very intensely since the beginning of the 10th of May 1940, just in that one campaign. And they've also had to take the Netherlands and Belgium at the same time. So even though everything develops quickly, it's still difficult for them. I mean, when they get to Dunkirk, for instance, they really are quite shocked by coming up against British Spitfires in greater numbers for the first time. And that's absolutely terrifying for them, because even though they've had tenacious opponents, they've come up against the Polish Air Force, and of course against the French. It's still one of those moments where they've not been used to having that kind of aerial equity in the same way. So they have their moments of absolute triumph. They have their fighter pilots day in the middle of May, for instance, where they've managed to, shoot down a lot of antiquated RAF aircraft. So really the bragging rights are a little bit exaggerated. But they are feeling the effects of those campaigns back to back. Norway, for instance, in Operation Weserübung in April 1940 was intense. They had an awful lot to try and support there when you've got amphibious invasions there. So the fighting over Narvik is also fierce. So it's not an easy ride for them. And there is already some exhaustion, even just flying. People won't think of it this way, but flying over Dunkirk just before you get Operation Dynamo is actually stressful for them, because the French have still got a lot of their flak batteries are still standing, earlier in Case Yellow. And as a result, they don't want to fly it, because they know that it's such a packed situation. It is this tight pocket of France, but of course they're looking at what could happen to them, as well as the fact that they're trying to take down the men that are heading towards the beaches. So it is a really exhausting thing for them. The Bf-110s start to struggle a bit more. They'd seen a bit more success in Poland, but they'd already started to lose quite a few more over France than expected. And they've also lost quite a few of their bombers as well as transport aircraft. So really, it's going to take them quite a while to try and recover those kind of airframes and to put more in circulation, particularly as they don't have particularly good reserves, which ends up being a problem very much in the Battle of Britain.
So they get stuck in pretty quickly in the Canal Creek. They're going after the convoys, which is always sort of that really short chapter at the beginning of a Battle of Britain.
Yes.
You spend a bit more time on it. Why is it important from that Luftwaffe viewpoint, that stage of the battle? Because traditionally it's the bit before the exciting stuff, but you sort of try to change that viewpoint slightly here. Why is that?
I think because it's the thing that really captures people's imagination about the Battle of Britain are the dogfights. There's sort of the close quarters, Hurricanes, Spitfires, Bf-109s, all swarming around each other. And I think it feels a little bit more, I don't know, like high stakes, because the bombs are hitting the British mainland. I don't know. When we get to Eagle Attack, we have that escalation in the bombing war, and the stakes end up becoming ever higher. And I think perhaps some of it is that visceral idea of, because in the Eagle Attack, you've got those mainland attacks and they are frequent and day to day. And obviously that gets even more intense with the Blitz later on. I think it sort of pushes Britain and its mythology even more into its island mentality and its thinking. But I think it's interesting with the Channel Battle, because, that's quite a frenetic phase. It's not as intense as, when we start to get about 2,000 sorties on some of the highest days, on Black Thursday, for instance, on the 15th of August. But it's still about 1,300 sorties across the 5 weeks. So it's not completely idle. And it does force the British to kind of reevaluate how the Allied shipping on the convoys can pass through the Strait of Dover, for instance, and what's safe to pass through in daylight hours and what isn't. And so it's one of those phases where I think perhaps people don't see it as romantically, and I think it's also, in maritime operations, of course, you're more likely to see the Stuka, but I think the idea is with the Junkers 87 is that I think people just write it off in the Battle of Britain, and so I think that maybe that's why it gets slightly ignored in the Channel Battle. I'm not sure, but I think it just doesn't quite evoke the same sense of coming out of your house and watching the dog fights up above and kids going, oh, that's Ginger Lacey, and being called, I think they're called goofers, I think they were called, and they even had public information films that basically you shouldn't go outside and watch the dog fights, although who would listen to that? I would be out there like a shot. I'm sure you guys would be as well.
Yeah, very fair.
Yeah,
I found that section very interesting, and that, as you said, the discussion of the G87 as well, because it's that narrative of oh, it was as soon as the Battle of Britain starts, it's rubbish. Well, it doesn't become rubbish. Its use in that tactical environment is poor, and you know some of the bits and pieces you've got from the Stuka crews are they had utmost confidence in their aircraft, even though they were up against some terrible odds.
Yes, I mean the Stukas, they do get very much stereotyped in the Battle of Britain, and it is fair to say that their vulnerabilities are shown up properly for the first time. You know, they do not match up in cruising or indeed top speed to Spitfires, Hurricanes, etc. So yes, they do have terrible days, but I think it's one of those things that really, they have their bad moments, but I think it's sort of when people say, oh, well, they were withdrawn for the rest of the battle. Well, really, they just didn't have the range to be useful for the other phases, for going all the way to London. I mean, the BF 109, for instance, used 2/3 of its fuel capacity just getting to Britain and back, and it drops to about 10 minutes in the active combat zone over London. So, I mean, you do get the development of the Junkers 87Rs that are able to go further, but it's not well suited to what they're trying to hit at that point. Trying to have singular Stukas hitting a city centre is in that sort of capacity when you're not in a siege and you're not supporting an army on the ground. It's just kind of illogical by that point.
Right, let's do some techie questions.
I'll go and have a cup of tea. No, I'm joking.
There we go.
I mean, we've got a few from viewers as well, some techie ones as well. But yeah,
I've been keeping an eye on it, so I'm gauging this carefully.
Good.
So when I'm trying not to ask other people's questions, because that's why they're all here, is to ask
Indeed.
But let's talk about the sort of the Spitfire snobbery section.
Yes.
Really. Because you've got, I'm a big fan of the BF 109. I think it got stretched far longer in development than it needed to, but it still did the job. And at this point, we're sort of getting to the peak, and I guess it's the email at this point, isn't it? Now, for the fighter pilots, having come through France, having gone up against plenty of Hurricanes and had success against them, what is their viewpoint as they start looking over across the channel to the Spitfire and the Hurricane? Because some of the pilots, Luftwaffe pilots, have flown Hurricanes and Spitfires as well. But what are the issues that they suddenly start finding?
Good question.
Excellent question. So they've already, I think what makes more sense is to actually start with their interwar interpretations of them both, and then go into how that helps it make sense. That's okay.
Go for it.
Yeah. So it was one of those things that with the Hurricane, they weren't all that impressed with it in the interwar period. I wrote an article once on the July 1939 International Brussels Air Salon, and ultimately this was sort of an international air exhibition that happened in Brussels shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War, and there was a Hurricane demonstration there. In fact, there were two. And one of them was done by Richard Reynolds, the very famous Hawker test pilot. And so he had, the German press were a bit mocking of it because they said, oh, it's excellent flight demonstration, but that's clearly a modified Hurricane. Like, they'd seen the slower, more antiquated Hurricanes that the Belgian Air Force had acquired, and they weren't so impressed with those. So the fact that they sort of brought a more modern Hurricane directly from Hawker to test, it was one of those things that the German press was kind of trying to put it down. The thing I find funny about the Spitfire is that when they first come across it, they actually give it the wrong name. They don't realize it's Super Marine. They just call it Super Spitfire. So they're not quite paying attention to it in the with the German journalists. But the difference is that with the Hurricane going into the Second World War, they used to occasionally come across them in the phony war, and as a result it was one of those things where they again often came up against antiquated Belgian Hurricanes, and Adolf Galland spoke about this and the fact that it really didn't worry them too much. And a lot of the Luftwaffe aces that became very well known in the Battle of Britain had really cut their teeth on Hurricanes and had started to generate those kills. So Werner Mulders, for instance, had bagged quite a few. So they had not been very impressed with the Hurricane. The Spitfire, as mentioned earlier, they came up against Dunkirk. Obviously, it's greater agility. It's a bit faster. The Hurricane lags a bit behind the Bf-109. The Spitfire is slightly faster than the Bf-109. So that's a little bit of a shake for them. You know, it's a bit of a shock because of the fact that they've got used to flying against Hurricanes. And also, I think it's one of those things where for the first time, they properly start to come up against each other in the Battle of France, and they start to see some of the limitations that the Bf-109 has against both the Hurricane and the Spitfire. So the main thing that most Bf-109 pilots were in agreement with was the fact that the Hurricane and the Spitfire could outturn the Bf-109. Now, there was one guy, I think it was Erwin Lehrkauf, who he felt the Bf-109 actually could outturn a Spitfire and a Hurricane in theory, but the leading edge slats would basically come out and they would bang if they turned too fast. And as a result, the Bf-109 pilot would often be scared that they've been hit. So he thinks that some of it is potentially psychological, but it is a point that a lot of the fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe bear in mind when they're coming up against the RAF. And as a result, they always try to get the initiative where possible. And it's this tactic of being high on a perch and trying to use the advantage of altitude in order to make sure that they can catch fighter command unawares rather than having to get into a defensive situation. So with the Spitfire snobbery, that was already in the Nazi press leading up to the Battle of Britain. And the Spitfire was actually used in Germany to boost the skill and the achievements of Bf-109 pilots that had shot them down, because the Nazi press would go on about, in Deutsche Luftwaffe, for instance, which was German Air Watch magazine, it would talk about how, you know, that's the best the British can give to us. You know, the Spitfire is said to be the, you know, the deadliest fighter, and they can't even defeat us with that. You know, getting any sort of picture of a downed Spitfire was very important to Nazi propaganda. So you get this kind of rise in myth and legend around the Spitfire, which is interesting because it sort of is working the same way in Britain, but it's in a different way. It ends up being a get out of jail free card if you get shot down, because if you can say I got shot down by a Spitfire, then it saves face a bit more, because it's this much vaunted machine and it's perhaps the Bf-109's only true rival, at least in this time period. And as a result, it's one of those things where they kind of, you know, it's an excuse for them, to the point that sometimes they would protest with Hurricane pilots that they met. So Peter Townsend, for instance, remembers arguing with a Luftwaffe pilot who said, you know, I'm so pleased to meet the Spitfire pilot that shot me down. And, you know, Townsend was absolutely insisting. He said, I'm sorry, I'm a Hurricane pilot. And the Luftwaffe pilot says to him, well, if anyone asks, and you please tell them I was shot down by a Spitfire. You know, it was really that baked in. So I think it was partly that. Matt, you said earlier on about also that they'd flown some of these aircraft, which was true. I think where they kind of got a little bit out of the loop was the fact that they had flown versions of the Hurricane and the Spitfire that were earlier, that hadn't yet adopted higher octane fuel, that hadn't adopted a different kind of, you know, propellers that works at a constant speed. So it's one of those things that it kind of, they flew them, and specifically, I believe it was Werner Mulders, I think, that tested them out. But it was one of those things that they just had got versions of it that simply were a little bit out of date. And so that kind of caught them a little bit unawares, I think, going further into the Battle of Britain.
And just to jump in a bit, although I'm not the techie guy, this part of the war, isn't it a little bit of a case that all pilots, as indeed in some ways all tank commanders, kind of think their one is the best, because that's part of the mind over matter aspect, in that by the end of the war, the Allies can absolutely say they've got some of the purely best kit and tech based on experience and development. But at the beginning of the war, everyone's sort of going in relying to some extent on reputation and just self-belief. Isn't that kind of part of it at this part of the war on both sides?
That is part of it. Yes, I think aircraft loyalty is definitely a thing.
Yeah.
And in the Luftwaffe, for instance, the thing that really epitomizes that is in the 1969 film Battle of Britain. There is the famous scene of the chap that's based on Adolf Gallant saying that he wants a squadron of Spitfires. Now, it's interesting because the British jumped on that after the Second World War to kind of show like, oh, look, even the Germans said that the Spitfire was superior to the Bf 109. But Gallant explains in The First and the Last that he didn't really mean it like that. He just wanted to say something that was going to get under Goering's skin. And not only in sort of the Luftwaffe veterans' memoirs after the war, but also in some of the captured or rather the bugged intelligence, the British intelligence on captured Luftwaffe prisoners. There's a lot of loyalty expressed to the Bf 109. And there's one pilot, for instance, that says about how anyone who claims the Bf 109 is inferior, they're weaklings and that's ridiculous. And there's no way it could be inferior to any other aircraft kind of thing. And then there's others that are a little bit more pragmatic and realize that their aircrafts have their strengths and weaknesses. And the Bf 109 pilots, I think, were a little bit more sorry, not the Bf 109, Bf 110 pilots, the Zerstörer, the destroyer. I think they were a little bit more judicious, and they would say, well, we really like the fact that our aircraft is so heavily armed, but they would often say about how they didn't like the fact that being a twin-engined aircraft, it was a little bit more unwieldy next to a Hurricane or a Spitfire and single-seat aircraft. So I think it depends. I mean, I think some were just so believing so hard in the Bf 109, and of course, this is an era where German superiority from a technological perspective is drilled into them in the Nazi propaganda as well. So I think that might also have a bit of a bearing on just how perfectly some of them saw the Bf 109. But, they're all impressive aircraft for their era,
And some of it ends up just being subjective to some extent. It's just opinions and, I like this one because, and you can't argue with someone who says that in their memoirs, be they British, South African, Rhodesian, German, whatever. If they've got an opinion, that's valid.
Yeah, because they flew it. That's the thing. They flew it and they lived it. And, they also develop a certain kind of loyalty to their aircraft if they're going to get them out of sticky situations. I think people often don't realize that airmen have an affinity with certain aircraft, and there's some that give them a lot of trouble, and there's others that have got them out of sticky situations. So I think it's important to see it that way, in that sense of having that trust in their aircraft to some degree, and making sure that if it gets them home safe, that's the one that they need.
Yeah. Matt.
Okay, techie bit over. Let's talk about August. That month makes up, the sticky wicket for the RAF. That whole difficult thing. As soon as you say August 1940, the pilot's names, the RAF pilot that looks about 400 years old. He's so tired.
Brian Lane.
Yes,
Brian
thank
Lane,
you.
Yeah.
That's the image that comes to everybody's mind.
Yeah.
What I found reading your book, that is, was how you sort of take that sort of narrative and start showing that the sortie count on the Luftwaffe side as well, that grinding effort to go against it. So when you were writing that side of it in August, how were you, I'm not going to say parallels because that's not what I'm after, but what are you finding from the accounts of the constant attempts to get through while they're still desperately coming up with a plan to get Sea Lion going?
I think there is already a growing fatigue there, even as they're getting towards Eagle Day. There's one letter in the book, which you might remember, which is from a Luftwaffe assistant doctor, and he's with a bomber wing in the Luftwaffe. And on Eagle Day itself, he talks about how, the men in his Geschwader are all ready. Their nerves are shot. They miss home, they're homesick, they are feeling the loss of their comrades. There's a frustration as well from this man that there's a lack of kind of changing. There's no rest rotation in the same way as there is in the RAF. So as a result, he actually not only is worried for the I suppose the well-being of his men, but also he's getting frustrated at the men who are back home in the Reich that he feels should be playing their part. So already his morale is starting to dip going into the Battle of Britain. Now, he's a doctor. So, of course, even when you've got all of these rolling victories of what the Germans called the Wonder of 1940, you've still got a lot of horrible things to do. You still have to be, confirming the dead. You've got to be dealing with really horrific injuries. So he has got a very macabre view of what's happening. But he does talk about the fact that his entire wing is exhausted. You know, every single man he's got into contact with, has been in touch with, is utterly done in. So I think in terms of how tiring it is on the Luftwaffe, I think the thing is that they're trying to launch so many sorties that they just do not have time to breathe and fully reflect, and not adequately pivot, because they just, as we see with Goering, you know, there is so much impatience in the Luftwaffe High Command, and the flitting between, yes, we're going to go all out on the radar stations that have been identified, and then they're like, well, actually not one of these has been put out of action, so then it drops back in its importance to the Luftwaffe's overall strategy or its tactics specifically. So I think it's one of those things that they're already feeling it going into August, and they just haven't really had time to fully settle in. They've captured this country, and yes, of course, it gives them great advantages in terms of it's helped to create this really menacing crescent around Britain on the continent, but they're having to get used to this new situation. They're having to fly over the English Channel. They've got the threat now of, if they bail out, they're over enemy territory and that's it. And so it's not just the physicality and the exhaustion that comes from even just flying your missions, but also the psychological aspect of knowing you've got to go again and again, and sometimes 3 times a day, 4 times a day, 5 times a day, and having to try and, you know, stay sane through it all.
Which brings me to a bit I found very interesting was, and I'm going to murder this word, and you can
That's all right.
The Erholungsheim convalescent home.
Yes, the Erholungsheim. Yeah. Yeah. You were
Nearly
close. You were close.
Close.
No, that was great.
Yes. Again, there's this idea that they flew them till they dropped, but
yes,
that's not operationally sound. So what were the Luftwaffe doing as well, especially without your doctor as well, to try to keep these guys in as best fighting condition as they can? Granted, it's the two situations are still very different, but what were they trying to do?
They were trying to let the men's nerves recover. So the thing is, in the Luftwaffe, when they're on the front line, the immediate Luftwaffe High Command are not very understanding. And Karl Fick, for instance, tried to protect the psychological well-being of his airmen by sending them for a swim or sending them for a walk or trying to give them some sort of break, because, you know, as mentioned earlier, the Luftwaffe doesn't have the same rest rotation system as we see with the Allies. So they have to try and sort of snatch bits of time off here and there. But the difference in the Luftwaffe is that it had a lot of psychologists, and the psychologists had already been in place from, you know, around 1935 or so, and it had its own psychological service. And the thing is that already, as we start to get to the outbreak of the Second World War, the Luftwaffe has about between 30 to 40 psychologists that are all trained in aviation psychiatry, and who have not only helped to recruit the men by putting them through all of their different paces and interviews and things, and they've tried to weed out those that they felt weren't quite so well suited to military life, but also they are there if they do fall apart. And the thing that's interesting is that even if there was just one man that was struggling in a Luftwaffe bomber crew, for instance, they would often take the whole bomber crew out, because it's sort of like a weak link in the whole thing. So they knew that it's not at the same level of efficiency if they just throw up, you know, all of the crew and this one guy that's suffering. So they would take them out and make sure that, yes, part of it is efficiency of your crews, but also once they got to the psychologists, they were actually very understanding. And, you know, I think it took the RAF about until 1943 to have the same amount of psychologists as the Luftwaffe did in 1939. And there they have basically what's called the Erholungsheim, which is a convalescence home. So the convalescence home is designed to be a bit less of a clinical atmosphere. They don't want the white walls. They don't want it, you know, completely barren and sterile and that sort of thing. And so they were often in very nice sort of country locations and estates. And they tried very much to avoid nurses in white and things like that because they thought it would seem very triggering to them. And the thing that's quite interesting is that I think the reason that the Germans were so understanding in the same in a different way is because they sort of had more of a physical interpretation of what war neurosis was, and they called it sort of being abgeflogen, which is sort of like having taken off. Now it doesn't sound nice from a mental perspective that this person is taken off, but it's not actually what it refers to. It refers to the fact that there's the vibration of an aircraft, and so they were under the possibility that actually they might have got developed this war neurosis from the shaking of the aircraft. It's like they've absorbed the vibrations and the exhaustion of those flights. So I think that's why the Luftwaffe psychologists were a bit more understanding, is because they ultimately thought it was more of a physical thing rather than sort of having lack of moral fiber as you'd have in Bomber Command, for instance. It's not a character deficit. They don't see that in the same way. But I think it's interesting because they do have some serious concerns in the Battle of Britain in terms of, well, I don't know if you can call it mental health, but we'd call it mental health today. And for instance, the suicide rates in the Luftwaffe rise very steeply towards the end of the Battle of Britain, to which point I think they get to about 79 attempts and committed suicides. And I think it as far as I can see, it is that sort of crossing over into the fact that the Battle of Britain itself hasn't been all that successful, and they're looking at this long time in the Blitz. It's hard to say who actually it's referring to. Unfortunately, it's more of a Surgeon General bulletin, but at the same time they have to actually put out an order in 1941 to prevent suicide, and this is even before we get into anything like the Eastern Front. So they do have those kind of downswings, but in the convalescence homes they try to see if they can nurture them back into health and if they can go back on the front line, but only about 30% end up going there, and the rest end up either being put in munitions factories or putting in ground crew or ground personnel roles in the Luftwaffe.
I just want to jump in a little bit because there's been some really lively conversations in the sidebar. Victoria, but,
oh my!
We've talked a lot in the past about how, you know, I grew up with the idea that the Battle of Britain is pretty much just the fighter pilots, like you said, you know, battling over Kent. It's dogfight fight somewhere, and now we understand it's an integrated air defense system. It's the Observer Corps. It's Bomber Command. It's Coastal Command. It's the hospital system. It's communications. It's dispatch wide. It's all that there. And you know, your book, you know, in the blurbs and stuff, you know, you talk about the fact that you bring in the experience of paratroopers and anti-aircraft gunners and things like that as well. I mean, you know, we're obviously guilty in some ways of seeing the Battle of Britain from the German point of view in that same narrow view, that it is just the people getting in the aircraft and coming, you know, hopping across the channel. But actually, there's a much wider set of organizations behind it. So, you know, how important was it for you to bring in those other elements? You know, because obviously the people of Britain only ever saw that point of the spear coming over the channel, but there is this shaft of the spear behind it that clearly, you know, talking about the war neuroses, there is all part of it from the German experience. So tell us about bringing in those other aspects.
Sure. I like the way that you described that kind of seeing the spear and not necessarily seeing what's behind it. So I think it was important to me, firstly, because luckily I just happened to come across the letters and they'd put irrespective of the Luftwaffe branch, they were all put together, you know, so that was easier in terms of finding those perspectives. But I think it was because so often when we've tried to move beyond looking at the Battle of Britain just through the kind of the elite aces and sort of those smaller kind of microcosms, we've tried to look at what the Battle of Britain meant to Britain, which is its finest hour in the RAF. And we've got so many histories now of Britain more widely during this period and sort of the ways in which they'd rallied behind the RAF. But I think it was one of those things where I thought, well, I want to show just how important this was to the Germans at the time, because, of course, that's what's driving their combat motivation, is that this is meant to be. This is their own trying to... It sounds far too humanitarian, and it's not meant to at all. But, you know, they're trying to secure their version of peace, which obviously is not a way that is of, you know, a way in which Europe wants. It's tyranny and it's destruction and terror. But to the Germans, they see it as wanting peace. And so there was a lot on the line there for them here, because, you know, it's like Werner Baumbach, who's a bomber pilot in the Luftwaffe. He writes in his diary about the fact that, you know, the German public are getting so antsy and they're so twitchy, and they're used to victory after victory after victory. And then suddenly we get to the Battle of Britain, and he writes about how, you know, they just expect more and more and more. And that's so exhausting in their own way. And that's weighing on the shoulders of the Germans. But also they've got all the expectations of the army and the navy. They've got all of their plans and joint exercises in the background, and they're trying to get their men ready. But also the Luftwaffe have I think the huge disadvantage of the fact that they've got to try and get this air superiority or air supremacy in the Battle of Britain. And they don't even know if the German army and navy are going to be ready for it. Whereas at least the RAF knew that it could count on the Fleet Air Arm. It could count on the British Army and the Territorial Army within the anti-aircraft units. And so everyone's pulling together in a different way. So I think it's one of those things where they sort of, yeah, you know, it's such an exhausting thing for them. And I think we just don't necessarily look at all the different views. The fact that there's the men that are loading the bombs, the fact that they are dealing with the air signals units, and of course the paratroopers are being expanded quickly by the end of the summer of 1940. So all of these different arms of the Luftwaffe have to be prepared to have to start making the British crossing if they need to. So they're all primed too, but we just don't see it because they're not yet engaged in the fighting in the same way.
Brilliant stuff.
Yeah. Sorry, buddy. You mentioned that sort of the desire for the home front to get a victory. You start sort of not wanting to spoil the end of the book. It's not a spoiler. The Luftwaffe still lose, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, if you don't know that by now, in 2025, I don't know what to tell you.
That would be revisionist history taking it a little bit too far.
Yes, I don't claim it's a victory for the Germans.
But you do bring in the effect of Bomber Command as well. And I think the thing that I need to be reminded of as well is that bit that the Germans start evacuating their children as well.
Yes.
And the home front. And that I just love to get your sort of feelings when you start weaving that into the narrative, because I think that will bring a few readers up short, thinking that the bomber command raids were small compared to what would come. Yeah, but they were having that effect that already they were looking at the evacuation.
They were, yes, because we've got to bear in mind towards the end of the summer of 1940. We do start to get the first raids closer into the German mainland before it's sort of been attacks on places that can be kept a bit further away from civilian populations, like Wilhelmshaven, for instance. So there's a very small scattering of bomber raids in the early summer of 1940. But the thing is, Goering promises before the Second World War that, you know, bombs are not going to fall on, well, you hear it two ways. Sometimes you hear it that it's not going to fall on the Ruhr. Sometimes you hear it's not going to fall on Berlin. But the Berliners do confirm after the war, you know, some of the eyewitnesses were convinced that Berlin wouldn't be bombed, and that Goering often gave this motif. So they are shocked by the fact that any bombs can drop on it anyway. We're looking at it from, you know, Bomber Command's perspective in those early years. It's not as accurate as it wants to be. It needs some reforms in terms of its navigation, in terms of having proper reconnaissance to see how accurate the bombing is. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I think one of those things that we don't see, that this is still a huge shock to the Germans. It's not enough to end the war, but it's enough to start to cause a lot of paranoia in certain cases. You know, in Kiel, for instance, there's a really early raid where they were going for a different target, because of course it's a port, but they dropped some bombs and hit a post office, and already some of the local reports, I think it's a Sicherheitsdienst one, a security service report, says about how there's an outbreak of worry amongst some of the women and children, and some of them have got sick with the stress, and, you know, and physically sick, you know, getting colds and coughs and all sorts of things from the stress on the impact on their immune systems. And even going into the spring of 1941, when we start to get a few more hits against Hamburg and again Kiel and places like that, they do talk about the fact that already they're starting to create, you know, a certain number of refugees then, even though we see it as it not being a particularly heavy period for bombing. And I think we don't really see bomber commanders hitting its stride until perhaps Operation Millennium in 1942. So it's one of those things that is so interesting, because you start to get the psychological impact of being under bombs, the fact that some of the Luftwaffe personnel write back to their wives and family and say, are you okay? And please don't pick up any bombs. And this is happening on, you know, the 30th of August. 1940, there's a letter from a Luftwaffe serviceman saying to his wife, I've heard there's bombs in Berlin. I'm so worried about you. Please take care. And so I think that's the thing. We don't look so much at both the morale, the impact on the civilians that come under these raids, even if they're not necessarily intended, you know, that they're not firestorms in the style of Hamburg or Dresden. But they are unprecedented. The Germans aren't used to this. The British have had some experience in the First World War under Zeppelin and Gotha raids. The Germans have not had that same sort of experience in the same way. So it's interesting when you look at it. I think that the Bomber Command raids weren't absolutely for nothing in this period. You know, it's still unsettling to them in a different way.
Right. Last one for me, and then we'll go over to the viewers. I guess we have to ask the London question, really. That change of target, because one of the things that I found interesting as well was your sort of laying out of the contact rates as well. So August, you're looking at about 25-30%. That switch to London changes the game, because it gives the RAF a lot more time to intercept the raids. How did that affect the Luftwaffe crews, and of course the guys on the ground trying to patch these things up, from going from, what was it, I think September 15th, 77% contact, which is extraordinary.
Yes. Excellent question. I think the thing is that because the RAF was starting to be ground down towards the end of August 1940, it's not at the level of being utterly defeated. I think so often it is presented as being pretty much down and out. That's it. And thank God they switched to the Blitz sort of thing. And it's not the case. The fighter command wasn't in as much of a dire strait as is often presented at the end of August 1940, but it has had a hell of a fight. And I think that is reflected in the fact that, you know, I think it's Hans Eckerhard Bob, I think, wrote about how towards the end of August, sometimes they would fly to Britain and barely be engaged. And so that sort of seemed to corroborate some of the favourable intelligence reports that suggested that fighter command had been suppressed pretty much. And so I think that's why the 15th of September 1940, when we get Battle of Britain Day, I think that's why it's such a shock to them, because it seems when they're flying over, it seems to be kind of matching up with what they're being told. So when they get this pretty much, you know, big wing in their face on the 15th of September, and as you mentioned, Matt, the fact the contact rate goes up to 77%. I mean, part of that, of course, is the fact that they've got so many more fighters in the air from the British. So statistically, they're more likely to bump into more German aircraft. But it is also a sign of the fact that they've been able to refine radar so carefully, and they've been able to make sure that they can conserve their strength, and that they're able to I mean, with Air Vice Marshal Sir Keith Park, for instance, he's been so careful to hold on to his reserves until the absolute minute he needs to let them in. So it's very much a combination for the RAF, but it's such a hammer blow to the Luftwaffe, because not only are they feeling a bit disorientated by the fact they've been moved into this new phase of the Luftschlacht um England, and the fact they're attacking London now rather than smashing away at RAF airfields so consistently, but it's just the sheer force of what comes back to them that really they just know it cannot be sustained.
Great stuff. Matt, you've muted yourself. You know you're muted. Oh, he's it. Yeah.
No, I muted because I said that was my last question before.
Okay, we'll do some from you. I'm just engrossed in
Yeah.
everything. There's a couple of great. I mean, we can't get to all of them, folks. Well, we just can't.
Yeah, sorry.
There's a couple of really good ones. Here's one from Sir Capo that is really well done. What was the role of Germans from outside of the pre-World War II nation state in Luftwaffe? Comparing this to the role of foreigners in the RAF, because that whole aspect of there being South African and French and all the different nationalities that were part of the RAF has really been part of the more recent narrative, where when I was growing up, it was very much the posh kids, the posh English kids in the skies. So the German point of the Luftwaffe, we've been using the word German and Luftwaffe, but is there an international element?
Yes. So in terms of Germans that had been outside of the pre-World War II nation, I think most had already made their way back to Germany if they'd desired to. Obviously, we should give a word to the Austrian airmen. Of course, there's so many Austrian airmen that make up the Luftwaffe in this period. And what we have to bear in mind is the fact that to the Austrians, the Luftwaffe was incredibly enticing as even an interwar employer, because Austria didn't really have an air force. And when you start to get the Anschluss, for instance, you get this sense of some German boys like Paul Zorner, for instance, who later becomes, I believe he becomes a night fighter pilot, I think. Finally, he's able to learn to fly. He's got the resources to fly, because the fact that the Germans and Austria are becoming so interconnected, and they're wanting to make sure that they are recruiting Austrian airmen, they will subsidize them, they will pay for them, they will make sure that they get those opportunities. So yeah, having Austrians was incredibly important in the Luftwaffe. They're often they get a bit of a ribbing because they've got a different accent, of course, and they're getting greeted with Gruß Gott, and there's a little bit of ribbing there, the same way as in the British. You get that sense of, if you've got a bit of a regional accent, you're going to get completely
I don't know what you're talking about, says the man from Essex.
Yeah. But that's the thing, so that's part of it. But I think what's interesting in terms of that, I mean, it's mainly Germans and Austrians that make up the Luftwaffe, but the Germans had a far greater vision. I think more specifically Jodl had more of an idea of having more Italian divisions and having more kind of having a bit more interference from the Regia Aeronautica, which is the Italian Air Force, the Royal Italian Air Force. And they have a very embarrassing kind of show in the Blitz. And they have a few Italian, part of the Corpo Aero Italiano, who come over and fly, but it's really embarrassing. They don't do much. And also, I do love this report of a British intelligence division that basically they managed to pick up an Italian during the Blitz that had flown over, and they interrogated him, and he just complained about the Germans and their food, and he was just like, I just don't want to be here. And I love that report. He's like, I can't stand the Germans, I can't stand their food, I don't want to be fighting. It just, not to kind of solidify this idea of, the Italians didn't really want to be in the war, and to kind of, I don't want to whitewash fascist Italy, but it just made me laugh, the fact that they hated the weather, the food, the Germans, they just didn't want to be there. But there were certainly plans for Italian soldiers to be more deeply involved in Sea Lion had it gone ahead. Not only for the more that they'd have greater strength in numbers, but also for the propagandic angle, which actually links quite interestingly to the British angle, in terms of having had, the sense of an international brotherhood that's pulled together in the island of the last hope, and that you've got the Polish and the Free French and the Czechs and Slovaks and everybody. And so it's interesting that the Germans would have wanted to do it the same way with Sea Lion. I think we just think it must have all just been the Wehrmacht, but no, they wanted their own Italian divisions to be taken as well. And also, I mean, Mussolini, of course, would love to be part of something like that, and sort of helping to facilitate that Axis victory. So yeah, it's mainly German and Austrian, but they had ideas for having more involvement from
it's
the Italian
building blocks for a bigger concept later down the line. So
yes,
we're going to try and do a few questions, and we'll try and do this in a kind of not like a quick fire round, because otherwise we'll be here forever and ever. So Andreas from Germany,
slow fire round.
and I know you covered this kind of data. He's saying, what about losses by accidents and mechanical failures, and were these significant? And it kind of bounces off what Matt was saying about the number of sorties that increase and the flying time. Presumably, the more they're flying, the longer the more accident figures go up.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, not only from battle fatigue, but also just because you are exposed to more dangers over a longer period of time. So you've got more chance of something happening to you. In terms of flying accidents, actually quite high. I think from around the beginning of the war to around the Battle of Britain, I think it was about 30% of Luftwaffe losses were in training. They were high. And what didn't help the Germans is the fact that some of their aircraft were not always quite so forgiving. And when you had Werner Mulders, for instance, who had test flown the Hurricane and the Spitfire, he said about how they were childishly easy to take off and land compared to the Germans. And, they sort of had, it's like with the Junkers 88, for instance, even though it was the Germans' most advanced bomber, it was a bugger when it took off. It would lurch if you didn't quite manage it in the right way. And a lot of men got killed that way, to the point that they ended up having shortages in its crew by 1941. So they had their own dangers. Sometimes they had to issue bulletins that try to avoid these problems. In other cases, I mean, sometimes it was just silly things. They actually had to, I think it was sometime in the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe had to issue an order to the men in France because so many had been just driving stupidly and getting killed in accidents. It's like the folly of youth. And there was one Luftwaffe airman that confirmed that, a lot of people played fast and loose, and they loved flouting the rules in a different country, and that went all the way to the roads, to the point that sometimes they just got themselves killed in stupid car accidents.
But even that, Victoria, kind of challenges the perception of it being the Allies, who are kind of the plucky amateurs who don't really know what they're doing, making things up as they go along, and the Germans and the Luftwaffe are the in 100% professional. They've been doing it for years, slick, almost robotic like organization, when in fact you're exposing the fact that the Germans have just as many human errors and frailties as everybody else. This is coming back, this whole idea of we are, all of us, no matter how much we've read, we're burdened by the movie, the 1969 movie, the Spitfire adverts on the TV, all that kind of stuff. And so it's good that we're exploring just the notions of superiority, because superiority, we always talk about it in being this aircraft is better than that aircraft, but there's a whole kind of mindset and just morale and just efficiency behind it. But again, I'm now being the one rambling now, so we'll do another couple of
not at all.
Jason Giroux is saying every historian finds a surprising piece of evidence during the research process. When researching writers' books on Taylor, what did you discover that surprised you the most? So a classic but very important interviewer's question there.
Excellent question.
Bad for not asking it myself now.
We'll bring Jason in next time, a fourth person.
Yes, absolutely. Be most welcome. So partly the suicide rates, which I mentioned earlier, because again, it's that idea of thinking that it's such a, like an unstoppable force, that you don't think of that. I think also the fact that they took German, it sounds silly, I don't know why they wouldn't do this, but sort of reading into just how much research they did into hypoxia. the sort of chronic oxygen deprivation, and the fact that in the Battle of France, a lot of German airmen died just from not wearing their masks at the right altitude. So the fact that they had to put different types of Luftwaffe airmen's brains, those that had been killed, they sent them to proper facilities, one for hypoxia and one for other types of injury. And it's just such I mean, what happened to the brains? I know it's just kept me up at night. I'm like, what happened to them? It's such a weird thing, but you can understand why. Obviously, they have to look into the pathology and do postmortems. But I think I think the thing that disgusted me the most was finding out that already before the Blitz had completely finished, there were Luftwaffe doctors that were looking into aeromedical experimentation on prisoners of war, on what they called the feeble-minded, which of course is is an offensive way of saying those that had learning difficulties, and that they knew that these subjects would die, and they were already looking at that in May 1941. And I think everyone thinks about thinks of the Holocaust being a bit further along, but you've already got those elements there, and it's directly related to the fact that they were concerned about Spitfires growing in greater altitude, so they're looking more into these experiments to try to counter it due to their experiences in the air war. So I think that was another thing that I think if you're in military history, you both also know this as well and feel this. You kind of wear a bit of a suit of armor. And I think sometimes you can read a lot of distressing stuff. And it's not that it doesn't upset you, but it's just you have to put aside the emotional part to understand and make sense of what you're dealing with. But that was one that I just, immediate stomach drop. Just ew.
It's been something on our channel, I'm sure on Matt's as well, is that it's easy to kind of just fall into the tech comparisons and did this bomb do better than that, and did the fuse on that have an effect of that, and what about the rate of fire of this? But actually it's always the human element that really makes you stops you in your tracks, doesn't it? Because that they're actually looking at the suicide rates, they're looking at what happens to these pilots' brains. That is because that ends up being it's relevant today. We're still dealing with those same issues, whereas which aircraft was the best in this sense is irrelevant now because it was in the past. But this endurance and what can human beings put themselves through, that is still relevant. So we have a couple more questions.
And then human being is a very squishy thing.
Sorry.
The Mark I human being is a very squishy thing.
Very squishy thing.
We're inherently flawed. We're designed badly, I think, clearly, aren't we?
I think so. Yes.
So Trent is asking, this is and I'm glad he put the English version in there because I'm not going to attempt the German. A question about the Luftwaffe butterfly bomb during the Battle of Britain. Why wasn't it used on RAF airfields at scale? Did the Luftwaffe overestimate RAF flak? So that's an interesting angle there, because again the perceptions is that the Germans thought the British didn't have much stuff to defend everything. But so Trent is wording in such a way that maybe they were a little bit over cautious. What's your reaction?
I think what we've got to bear in mind is that they'd already had quite a lot of experience of flying over British flak. I think we perhaps think it wasn't quite so accurate. But the thing is that the Germans had picked up very quickly that there were certain belts of flak that were incredibly intense. So, for instance, they'd written in some of their reports, flak over Southampton, very good, which of course it was because Supermarines located there. So they'd already identified certain locations. Yes, it could potentially partially to be due with the altitude. I also don't know how much of it is a case of, whether there's an over reliance in this period on high explosives and incendiaries, because they know from their time in the Condor Legion and all the other different campaigns that that's worked for them so far. But yes, I mean, I can't answer as much on why they didn't use butterfly bombs more. I imagine some of it is perhaps also capacity and what they had prioritized in terms of their ordnance and what they had produced. But there was certainly fear amongst the Germans. As the Battle of Britain progresses, they are worried about the flak belts, and of course at this point they're developing their own defenses in the same way as well. They're coming into the creation of the Kammhuber line, and I think they are concerned that the British might be going in a similar route as well, particularly when they're coming up against more British cities, and of course they're starting to get better defended by flak later into the Battle of Britain.
So I'm going to have one more last question, and then we'll see whether Matt has something. And it's really, you're representing in some ways a newer generation studying this conflict, and you know, you didn't necessarily grow up as a kid hanging around with pilots who fought in World War II. You aren't necessarily quite as burdened by the movies, although you are going to be on Fighting on Film fairly soon, talking about movies.
Yes.
I do think we are entering an era where it will be a different perception of the Battle of Britain, because people will be using archives perhaps a little bit more as their go-to, rather than necessarily having grown up with the movies and all that, those kind of representations. Because it is all about the historiography. It is all about the changing perceptions of you know, whatever it would be, the Battle of Midway and D-Day. So do you think we're entering a new era?
I think we're potentially entering a more clinical era, for good and for bad. Because the thing is that sometimes if I've said something, you know, my PhD was on National Socialism in the Luftwaffe, and it was looking at, you know, how it served as combat motivation and morale in the Luftwaffe, and really how incriminated it was as a Nazi air force. And it was interesting because some of the historians I'd spoken to, some of them testified to the fact that, you know, they'd met some Luftwaffe aces after the war. And I can't remember who it was, but one historian told me about how they met a Luftwaffe pilot. And there was actually a picture of Hitler in his wallet. It was still there. It's like, oh, I've got something to show you, and showed him a picture of Hitler in his wallet. But of course, there's other historians who got very close to these veterans, really, and some of that is professional in terms of the fact that they potentially worked together and were given articles. And obviously, so many of the early histories of the Battle of Britain are by historians like Alexander McKee, for instance, who sat down and did all of these different interviews on both sides. But it's interesting because sometimes I've found they'll say, oh, but, you know, he was a proper gentleman, though. And they'll have that kind of nostalgia of the fact that they enjoyed meeting this man, and, you know, he was incredibly personable and that sort of thing. And I think it must be harder when they are in front of you, and they have, even whatever side they're on, they have endured things that we can never comprehend. But I think in some ways also, it's a little easier to strip away some of the nostalgia, I think, because we don't grow up in the same way of, you know, and I'm not attacking anyone here. This is a great way into history, but I think the war films and the airfix models and things like that, I think
I'm feeling slightly attacked here.
I'm sorry. Not everybody.
In
not
a
everybody.
good way. I feel seen.
I mean, I should put in with the caveat that some people, like your good selves, like I'm sure many of the listeners are, learn to hold one place for that nostalgia, but they learn to hold another place where they are critically minded.
Absolutely.
And
That's
absolutely, you know, that's the thing. And that's great. But I think there are some people perhaps that get very angry if history is not told the way that they want it to be told. And I think
territorial.
A bit territorial. And so I think it will be a little bit easier navigating it when you've not got the same sort of pushback. But I think it also depends on what history you're doing. I mean, for me, there's perhaps a bit less, you know, it's a bit more controversial in some ways, but in other ways it's a little bit easier because it's not the same way as trying not to offend, you know, like a British Battle of Britain hero or something like that, you know, and having the pitchforks come after you. It's not the same sort of thing. But it is also difficult in its own way because some people just want to say, oh, they were just like us. And I hear it so often, and it's meant to be a nice sentiment, but also it's so misguided, because if they were just like us, you know, why are we so relieved that the Allies won? You know?
It's a romanticized idea. So I mean, things we could run with these big concepts. We had the minor question coming, which we're not going to do, but we'll do in the future. Roderick said, in the end, could Germany have won the Battle of Britain? I mean, that's
see, I would want to go into this.
I mean, unless you've got a very quick, like 2-sentence soundbite, or just want to say no or yes, but Matt, I want to let Matt have the final word here because he's done the preparation. But unless you want to answer that one, there, I think that might just be a bit of a rabbit
a couple
hole.
of sentences.
Go for it. Yeah,
go for it.
I think air superiority, but perhaps temporary air superiority, could have been won by the Germans had they been a little bit smarter and a little bit more consistent. Air supremacy is pushing it. Successful invasion and occupation and consolidation, not possible, I don't think.
No, I think we're all in agreement on that. So, Matt, final question from you, or point, or comment.
Yeah, no. One point. If you are researching something that you're passionate about and you pick up a document and it cuts straight through your nostalgia and you go, oh, that's the document to keep going from. Because that's a painful feeling and an amazing feeling when you go, oh, well, what does this mean? So run with that.
Completely agree with that. Sorry. What were you gonna say?
No, the final question is, what do you hope your readers take away from this?
Good one. Yeah.
Thank you. So the thing I'd like them to take away is, firstly, do not always be complacent with well-known subjects. I think it's important that we do push new narratives, and I don't like it when we always focus on the same stories all the time. But I think it's important to have a balance, because at the end of the day, you just don't. These are the big stories, the big myths that get entrenched. They're also the ones that are most likely to be carried on into future generations. So you can't afford to get them wrong whilst you still have a chance and whilst you still have a living link. I think also taking away that, what I've gone for is going for the human experience in the Luftwaffe, but not humanizing it. I think there's a difference. I didn't want people to walk away and think they were the good guys, they should have won. I wanted people to walk away and be like, we can see certain strands of humanity in there, but at the same time, it's not the same worldview. It's not the same conditions. They were not fighting for the same things. And those things would have brought untold death and misery to this nation, even if they'd not been able to fully conquer it and hold it in place. The amount of people that would have been killed in the resulting struggle, and especially if they'd managed to hunt down some of the individuals that they had on the SS Black Book list, if they'd managed to round up British Jews, etc., it would have been horrific. So I think that's the thing. It's sort of, you can admire their bravery and chivalry, but you cannot lose sight of what they were fighting for. And even if they didn't consciously know it, they were still pushing an organization that really did get to some quite nasty depths at certain points.
Absolutely. Well, should we call it a day then, Matt? And then people will say, we want Victoria to come back. Well, we can maybe do that. But yeah,
go buy the books, folks.
Go buy the book first. So there are links
please
in the description below to buy the books. Buy at your favorite bookstore, online, however you want to do it. But it's definitely one worth adding to your shelves. And you've actually got the copy there, man. Just rub it in that I haven't got it, man. Just
I'm sorry. We need to get one to you ASAP.
No, okay. Well, Victoria, it's been delightful talking to you. Matt, your questions are fantastic. And viewers, some fantastic questions for you. We didn't get to everything, but we got to most of them. So we'll have to do this again, Matt, a double header like this, because it was pretty cool. It was easy. I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thank you,
folks.
Everybody, and thank you, Victoria.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
see you again soon. Cheers, Victoria. Cheers, Matt. Bye.
Bye.